Jonathan, welcome to People and Legal.
Hey, thanks, David. Great to be here.
I'd love to actually get you to tell our audience about what you do and how you do it and who you do it for.
So I run a niche practice called 𝘁supply Consulting, and my area is predominantly in that space around providers of products and services into the legal industry. How I got into it, my background, I used to work for a business called CCH, Walters Kluwer. I ran their business across parts of Asia for a number of years and then divisions of their business here in Australia. So I've been in that space around, legal tech, legal products for, you know, near 30 years. And in 2012, decided to sort of venture out on my own and ultimately kind of realized, I sort of started as a little side project kind of to see, how can I help people, that sort of thing. And it sort of really grew from there. Into really being able to help players in this space from some of the really big companies who have been in this space for a long, long time, all the way through to sort of little smaller players. And ultimately, my consulting and my skill set is really to help these guys grow their business. So it's really around market expansion, revenue growth, expanding a footprint, whether that's launching new product, whether that's marketing, whether that's a bit of M&A, partnerships and affiliations, things like that, or really revamping the sales and marketing. So it really sort of covers the gamut of helping these companies really grow, particularly in the Australian market and in Asia Pacific.
Brilliant. So, have you got a story that you don't have to name names, what the typical client is and what the issue was and how you actually solved?
Yeah, I'll give you one of the more recent ones that I just completed a couple of months ago, and it is quite an interesting sort of story because they are a local Australian-based provider of content solutions into the Australian legal market, and they sort of brought me in. Um, they'd had a revolving door of sales people and marketing people and had
Mhm.
sort of stagnated quite a lot with regards to their growth in this market. And so they really brought me in for a 3-month project to sort of really ramp up their revenue. And I think when I came in and when they brought me in, the feeling was that it was probably going to be around, okay, starting to hire new salespeople, starting to write um, compensation plans and how the sales and marketing activity really works. I was like, great, that's a sweet spot for me. I came in, and what was really interesting about that particular project was actually the first step to growing their revenue was around their product. So their product is good and has been in market for a number of years. But what's really interesting about it is that they have a free version and then they have a paid version of their product. And what I identified very quickly was actually their free version's really good. And it was preventing growth because people weren't moving off their free version into the paid versions because there was no real incentive to do so. And so what we really looked at doing was, okay, so how can we, what started off as a little bit of a sales and marketing kind of exercise really then
Mm.
flipped into becoming a product exercise. Okay, how appropriate is your product for the market? How can we sort of make tweaks and changes to your product offering to encourage more and more of your users to step up into the paid premium version? And what are some of the features of the free version that maybe we should start to be putting a little bit more behind the paywall of a paid version without disrupting the user experience, without experiencing a lot of blowback? And so that's kind of one of those typical projects where you come in to grow your revenue and then you sort of, a lot of organizations I work with think it's a sales problem. And
Yeah.
actually, a lot of the time it's a product problem or it's a product
Right.
fix and it's a product revamp. And so the first step in the journey to growing their revenue was actually around fixing the product and some of the pricing and some of the features and how their free and their premium versions dovetail with each other. And then after that, you can put in place all the sales and marketing mechanisms to then be able to sell that new revamped product into the market. And so that's kind of a typical example that the projects that I do are often around sort of 3 to 6 month projects where you come in, it can be a little bit transformational. And at the end of it, what I like to do is leave my clients in a much better position to sort of conquer the market than when I come in. And so that's kind of an example of the kind of things that I get brought in to do. Sometimes it's a very tight remit whether I want to, maybe it's a product launch or something like that. Often it's just come in and help us grow. How do we do that? A lot of companies I find, especially if they've been in market for quite a long time, what's obvious to an outsider is not so obvious to them. And so sometimes
Yeah.
you just need a fresh pair of eyes on the same problems they've been dealing with over and over and over again. And because of my experience and having dealt across this market for so long, often it's that fresh pair of eyes that can really kind of just move them along. And so that's a lot of what I tend to do.
The consulting you do kind of moves the needle. If you've got a situation whereby a company's actually they're a bit stagnant in terms of what they're doing from a growth standpoint, but folks who are stagnant in marketplace, folks might even be looking for an exit at some point in time along the way, and someone to help them like package things up in a really nice way. Folks are like looking to potentially raise money, and they've got a business plan they need to put together and understand how they can like attract investors. That consulting and that knowledge, the 30 years of knowledge, really talks to that.
Yeah, 100%. Often because this area around legal products and legal services is so interconnected, often it's just about joining some dots for these guys and saying, look, you should run a partnership with these guys because you run similar products, but they don't compete with each other. You're much better off being under the same tent, things like that. So it's really often
Yeah,
it's around matchmaking as well. So yeah, it's really interesting. I find this space around legal products and legal technology at the moment really interesting in the sense that you've got quite a few legacy players in the space who have been around for a long, long time, but the
yeah,
world is changing so quickly. AI
it
is
is.
really, dropping a lot of things on its head. And then you've got a lot of new, scrappy, but very smart people starting up new businesses, launching new products into the market. And so often having a really helicopter view of everything that's going on allows me to help them kind of join hands with each other and match make those
Yeah,
sorts of things. So I find that really interesting. I find the space around legal tech has shifted really quickly in the last 3 to 5 years from quite possibly there not being enough product that's appropriate for lawyers in this market. And now there's almost too much. Now lawyers have the issue rather of like, there isn't a product that solves my problem for this or this or this. Now it's, oh my God, every 5 minutes I'm getting a new company who's in this space trying to sell me something or trying to pitch their service to me. And it's kind of gone from a lot of the legal profession being underwhelmed by what's out there to now being overwhelmed by what's out there. And so I can help sort of companies cut through the noise a little bit and really kind of help them cut through and sort of, find their way into this market.
so just talking about that, if it's an international company, they want to come into into the APAC region. It's not just Australia, New Zealand, but also Asia. Got deep connections over there. But if they want to come into this sort of region, how do you help those companies?
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways, and I've had a number of clients over the last few years who have been interested in kind of expanding out into the Australian market, whether that's they have some level of footprint here and they want to expand on that, or they have nothing here and they're really starting from scratch. There's a couple of ways we tend to do it. It's not cookie cutter because every situation's a bit different. Um, Finding them channels to market here in Australia. And that by what I mean is people who they can partner with to sort of promote their products and services, bundle it in. That's one way of doing it. The second way of doing it is stepping back almost and kind of helping them understand how appropriate their product set is for the Australian market and helping them, for want of a better way of putting it, localize their product. And so I've got a client at the moment who is a very large overseas company. They have a pretty good footprint here in Australia already, and they are expanding aggressively. They are lacking one or two aspects of localization of their product. And so they've brought me in to essentially help fill that gap for them. And so what I'm doing is scanning the market and procuring the kind of products and the kind of feature sets that they need to embed into their product so that they have an absolute crackerjack product in this market. And so that's a lot of how we tend to do it. Sometimes they have a product that's already appropriate for this market and it's really around help. It's almost matchmaking them with the right people to sort of find their feet in this market and get selling. People who already have channels. And so if they're in the small law space or the big law space, finding people who have channels into those spaces. Often it's also about making sure that their product is appropriate for this market and helping them make it appropriate for this market. Because if you come in with a product that's not 100% appropriate for the local market here in Australia, it's a tough one to sell. Like, don't think about selling a product until it's appropriate for this market here. So sometimes you got to take one step before you take the other.
I mean, I've seen companies actually crash and burn. They've come into the marketplace, they've spent a significant amount of money trying to get market share and things like that. And 2 years later, they're scratching their heads going, what went wrong?
We see that a lot of the time. And throwing money at the issue or just hiring sales. We see a few of them who come in and they just like put sales reps on the ground here. Those guys, unfortunately, are not really set up to be successful. So I often look at those sorts of companies. I've had one client in the past who sort of brought me in as a bit of an SOS because they had a product, they had sales reps on the ground, the reps just weren't achieving results, and they sort of brought me in to just kind of like, what's going on and can you sort of fix it? And what we basically found was that the product they were selling was very appropriate for its original market overseas, and you really had to fix the product deeply and localize it. And so what I did is wrote them a roadmap for what to do. Oftentimes, it's not actually as hard as you think.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, you find people who have the appropriate knowledge or the appropriate technology in this market to embed into an overseas product so that you sort of take the best of what's being built overseas, you take some local expertise, some local tech, some local knowledge, you embed that, and then you actually have something to sell here in this market. So, but you do see a lot of crash and burn. You do see, and look, some companies are pretty well funded, and so throwing money at the problem is not always the best way to do it, and just throwing sales reps on the ground here is not always the way to do it. Finding your local space here. I mean, the market for the market here in Australia for lawyers is complicated, and the profile of a small law firm here in Australia is very different to the profile of a small law firm in the US or Canada or the UK. Same with mid law and big law, and so really understanding the nuances of a local market like here in Australia, I think, is really important for those guys, and that's what I often help them do.
I totally agree. Yeah, I just want to change topics for a minute, Jonathan, because I mean, there's so many interesting things we can talk about, and when we do over lunches and things sometimes, and that's it. But one of the hidden revenue sources, I think, for tech companies, and legal tech especially, is that white label OEM sort of play, where they've got some really strong tech that they can section off and actually then help other tech providers, right? Buy it versus build it and things like that. Is that something you've helped companies with?
Yeah, we've done a fair bit of
Mm.
that. Is 100% a great play because you get an established brand here in Australia who can white label a product. The end customer has a lot of trust in that brand. So I've done that several times. Sometimes I've done it with overseas companies who have come in. I've also done it with smaller local Australian players who are just kind of like, they've got a good product. They just struggle a little bit to get it in market. And what I'll do is introduce them to a larger player who has a gap in their product set, which, can get filled by this. So it works really well for both parties. Interestingly enough, I met up yesterday with a very large provider of content and software into the Australian market to have a chat to them about, insights that we're seeing and things like that. And they are very keen to look at more of those sorts of opportunities and to do a lot more of that white label OEM style deal, because for those sorts of bigger companies as well, they have this whole issue around, do they build it themselves or do they partner with somebody who may already have really good product, a really good service that they can essentially white label and sort of bring under their tent. And so it solves a problem for both players. It gives big companies, if it helps them fill a gap in their product set and what they offer to customers. And for smaller players, it gives them a channel that they would never otherwise have. And it works beautifully. And I've seen it work beautifully. I've put together a number of those deals. And based on what I'm hearing and seeing in the market right now, there's so much scope to do more and more and more of that. So what I would encourage, if there's anybody listening and you are looking for channels into the market here in Australia or in Asia Pacific, have a think about whether you're willing to white label your product and a bigger brand can essentially act as a sales channel for your product or service, because that is an absolute game-changing thing for a lot of these companies, and happy to help scope that out for them. I do quite a bit of that.
Three biggest mistakes that companies making coming into the region.
Number one, as I mentioned earlier, not getting the product market fit quite right, having a product that's excellent for their home market that's not quite right here, and sort of thinking, well, a lawyer there is the same as a lawyer here. So product market fit is number one. Number two is cultural understanding of the way lawyers practice here in Australia. And so when you have sales and marketing set up and channels here in Australia, the messaging about how you sell into the legal market is often quite nuanced for the Australian market. The way the messages that tend to cut through to Australian legal professionals can be quite different to the way it cuts through in other markets. So cultural nuance of how lawyers like to work, what they like to do, that sort of thing. And third one is kind of, just throwing money against a wall and hoping something sticks. It's like, have a real play and be scrappy. I think there's nothing wrong with being scrappy in a new market, right? So even if you are a very well-established player in the US, the UK, that sort of thing, come here with a little bit of a startup scrappy mindset. I think what I've seen is that there's a little bit too much of, okay, we're here now, we're going to make a big splash, and you crash and burn a little bit, because Australian lawyers do by and large operate large, like a lot of the time, on trust. And so they will work with trusted brands, they will work with trusted technology, particularly in a world of AI. There's so much trust that they have to put in the products and services that they use to help them with their work every day. So trust is earned. And so if you come here as a big overseas company and you haven't earned that trust by being a little bit scrappy, by really having the right messaging and by having the right product and market fit, you're not setting yourself up for the best success in this market.
Absolutely. To give some context for our audience as well, and from point of view of I guess, our relationship and how we're going to evolve that thing, and we're very lucky to have you as a podcaster on People Legal coming up and coming episodes and things like that. So basically interviewing people in the local market here who are actually founders, who've got a good story to tell, what they're trying to do. Jonathan, because of your wealth of knowledge, there'll be some great content that comes from that kind of thing. So we're very lucky to have you. So thank you for that.
No, I can't wait, and it'll be really fun to sit on the other side of sit on the other side of the interview. My background, how I actually got into the legal tech space originally, I started off as an editor at a company called CCH, and so back in my days as an editor, I used to interview people, and you're almost a quasi-journalist for some of the publications that you put out, particularly the ones that are a little bit more news focused. And so it's really cool to sort of get back into that space of sort of almost being like a quasi-journalist, asking the right questions, and really ultimately giving the legal community here and the listeners to the People in Legal podcast just insights and knowledge that really just makes light bulbs go off. I think that's a really cool thing to do.
Yeah, from our relationship over many, many years, I'd say that you're the guy who sort of taps the steamship, that one bolt to get everything working, where some people have gone and spent ages to try and fix that thing. So you're the guy who knows exactly where to go to get what's needed to happen in an amazing way because of your contacts. You're very well respected and like the industry. Your consulting project's very successful. I've seen some great entries of companies here and also some local folks here as well. And I think the interesting thing I think you'll bring to the podcast will be talking to potential investors in legal tech, talking to people in law firms that are the key decision makers, talking to founders and things. So there's a cross section of different folks you're going to talk to. Like give our listeners a great story in terms of what's really going in the marketplace. More to the point, I mean, I would encourage our listeners to really to contact your LinkedIn. And to basically just to understand, what it is, what's possible in this marketplace, for local folks that want to expand their offering or make sure they're getting things right, or if they want to go international, that's another conversation as well to have with you, as well as people coming into Australia. So folks coming into this APAC region and wanting to understand better how they can actually make that entry really seamless and smooth and actually, I guess, get the ROI they're looking for.
Yeah, look, thanks. I would love, please, if anybody's listening, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn. I'm always up for a chat. I like to help people, and I know that's a bit of a kind of a, lovey-dovey kind of statement, but the nature of my consulting work and what I tend to do is it all starts with a conversation, and that's and I find the best conversations often happen from people who just sort of find you and kind of go, oh, can you give me a bit of insight into this? Could you introduce me to that person? That sort of thing. And so I'm always up for that sort of stuff. And hopefully, just given the length of time and the networks I have in this industry, I can just help people either if they're at the start of a journey in this kind of legal tech space, or if they're kind of at the other end where they're part of an organization or they have their own business that's kind of been around for a while and they're sort of looking how to take the next steps. They're the conversations I love having. And so, I would love to hear from as many listeners of the podcast as possible. And like I said, always up for a chat and happy to help, whether that's formally or even just informally, with some insights, introductions, that sort of thing.
You know that you're like the Kevin Bacon of legal tech, right? So basically you go to a party or an event and it's like these degrees of separation from Jonathan Seifman. So that's what it's like.
Yeah, look, I never thought of that comparison, but thank you. I'll take it. It's very flattering. And, the best events are always the ones that you guys at Novum put on, and people in legal. And so, yeah, like I said, it's always great to actually catch up in person with networks and contacts in the industry, and long may that continue.
So Final note: if you're overseas and you're exec flying into the territory to have a chat with somebody about the marketplace and wanting to understand what's actually going on with someone with a finger on a pulse, Jonathan's your person.
Give me a shout anytime. That would be great. Thanks for the shout out, David. And look, it's always been great working with you and the team, and we've always had a great relationship, and it's always been mutually beneficial in terms of just being able to help each other out, and that's the way I like to work. Not everything has to be. I like doing things on a handshake a lot of the time, and there's a lot of trust with the people I work with and the networks that I have, and the more I can share that with the market and the industry, I'm always happy to do so.
We're looking forward to working with you on People Legal, Jonathan. Thank you so much for your time today. Always generous with your time. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.